Taking you next to Israel, to Netivot in Israel, and that is where we find Ellen Morrow. And Ellen, as we bring you in live, again, we were speaking to you earlier this morning, so I've seen this backdrop for anyone just joining us for the very first time. It is such a striking backdrop where you are reporting from today. So set the scene and explain what is going on what is the day 1 month exactly since the Hamas attack on Israel.
Well, Heather, viewers at home may remember images from the aftermath of those attacks showing burned out, destroyed vehicles outside of the Nova Music Festival and in the various kibbutzes that were attacked in southern Israel. And this is where so many of those cars have been brought. You can see the mangled, burned out mess of so many of them here. There's some 800 cars in this lot where we are now. So we have the ones that are completely destroyed, and there are others here that are significantly damaged that kind of give you a sense of what happened on that day. Take a look at this one. You can see bullet holes that completely destroyed this windshield here. And what's really stark beyond the damage, Heather, is what's inside. You know, this one, you can see this is like a sand mat, sort of a blanket that someone may have had, you know, just to have a nice day at that music festival before being caught up in the Hamas attacks of that day. And we've been talking to investigators here at the scene, and they said that what they're doing now is trying to figure out who all of these cars belong to. They still haven't identified the owners of all of these cars, and they said they go in some cases they have to clean up blood, or they look for tissue samples to be able to identify who these vehicles may have belonged to. They're also looking for samples for teeth, for the forensics, to be able to do that identification. And you can hear the thud of artillery fire as well. We're not far from Gaza, where we're standing now. The investigators also say that in some of the vehicles, there's evidence that people were tied up before either being shot at or being burned alive in their cars. We talked to one volunteer who's been helping do the forensics here and said that on this day, the emotion is particularly heavy here, Heather, 1 month on from the attacks.
As you say, you're listening to fire, and the retaliation continues to intensify. We know that, Ellen. More than 10,000 airstrikes in the past month. For the first time since the ground offensive began, though, we're hearing from Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about not just what's happening now, but what might happen next. What is he now saying, Ellen?
Well, we now have our clearest comments yet from Benjamin Netanyahu on what he sees for the day after the war in Gaza. And of course, there have been so many questions about what the end game is here. As you said, he spoke to ABC News, and he says that he feels like Israel will have some sort of indefinite security responsibility in Gaza after the war. Here's what he said.
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas, it certainly is not, I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it, when we don't have that security responsibility.
Now, there's obviously so much here, Heather, that remains completely unclear. We heard from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Israel on Friday saying that Israel should not occupy Gaza after the fighting. We've heard that from the White House as well. So still a lot of questions on what happens after all of this. In terms of a ceasefire, we know there's been growing pressure on Israel for there to be a ceasefire in this conflict. Benjamin Netanyahu in that interview said that there won't be a general ceasefire until the more than 200 hostages taken by Hamas are freed. But he did express some openness for so-called tactical pauses in the fighting. We know we talked about that with U.S. President Joe Biden last night. That would just be, an hour here, an hour there. Netanyahu said in that interview, depending on the circumstances, to get more aid in or to try to get hostages out. There have been some of those short pauses in the fighting in certain areas in the past to help get people from the north to the south, Israel says. But, what difference a few hours makes for the civilians of Gaza probably not very much at all. And the fighting continues to intensify. We're hearing from the Israel Defense Forces saying they're pushing further and further into Gaza City, that overnight they took a Hamas stronghold near Gaza City, that they found a weapons depot. They hit a weapons depot near Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City. And we did hear about strikes around that hospital in recent days that the Palestinian Red Crescent Society says injured dozens of people who were sheltering at that hospital, inside and outside. Israel again repeating its allegation against Hamas that it uses civilian infrastructure as a human shield. Now, we're hearing Israel again throughout the day today, as we've had in recent days and over recent weeks, again telling civilians to move from the north to the south. Israel says it's trying to find routes and ways for that to happen. It's saying some people are heeding those calls, releasing video, it says, that shows that. But aid agencies have repeatedly said, Heather, that evacuating in a war zone is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for so many people who remain in Gaza City. Israel is saying that it will be safer for civilians in the south, but we still also see continued airstrikes in the south of the Gaza Strip as well, in places like Khan Yunis and Rafah that have reportedly caused dozens of casualties today, Heather.
Israel, as you mentioned, Ellen, not at all considering a ceasefire until the hostages are released, the United States supporting them in that. But the calls for a ceasefire globally are growing louder. So what are some of the new voices on that today?
Well, we're hearing from UNRWA, which is the largest aid agency, a UN aid agency working in Gaza, posted earlier today, referencing that it's 1 month of war, talking about the struggle people are facing to get food, being bombed, calling it a tragedy of colossal proportions and forced displacement. That's very strong rhetoric, obviously. We also heard from Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN last night, condemning Hamas for the horror of what happened here on October 7th, for using civilians, Guterres said, as Israel has said, as human shields, but also saying the constant bombardment of Gaza needs to stop. And we can play you a clip now from the UN Human Rights Commissioner on those calls for a ceasefire.
I'm, of course, from a human rights perspective, extremely worried about the situation, about what is happening, and it is really important that a solution is found to end the violence and to get out of this horrible humanitarian and human rights situation for what's happening in Gaza.
Now, Israel, again, as I just mentioned, Heather, and as you did as well, pushing back on those calls for a ceasefire after what happened here on October 7th. But that pressure is growing as the death toll in Gaza mounts. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, as you said, says that more than 10,000 people have been killed, including more than 4,000 children. We also heard from the World Health Organization today saying that more than 160 health workers have been killed on the job during the violence there.
Ellen, thank you so much. Ellen Morrow, she's in Netivot in Israel.